Hello everyone, Mike at North Arm Knives here. Today I'll be showing you how to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and then reassemble one of our Skaha folding knives. It's not something you'll have to do often, or maybe never at all, but if you do have to do it, this video will be a good little guide on how to do it, what to do, and what not to do. We'll be working on my own Skaha today. It has been carried around in my pocket for a couple months now. Getting a little bit dirty inside, pocket lint and some gunk of various sorts, but anyway, we're going to take it apart here and see what we can do with it. What you're going to need are some T8 and T10 Torx drive screwdrivers or any other sort of tool. As long as you've got a T8 and a T10, you're going to be fine. And some sort of light oil. We use this fishing reel oil made by Daiwa. We find it, well, it's cheap and you can get it quite a few places, but it also has this fine tip applicator, which is really handy to get into all the bearings and pivots and so on. And then some isopropyl, or rubbing alcohol as some people call it. I've just got mine in a little eyedropper here, but it's just standard rubbing alcohol. Q-tips and some extra paper towel. Those are all really handy, but really you can use, you could even just use soapy water to clean it. That's fine too. Very important you work in an area where you're not going to lose any of the small parts, so have a clean working surface and don't work over an area that if something falls it's going to be gone forever, like a deck with slots between the boards or something like that, or over a sink. Definitely don't do that. Also handy is Windex and a little scrub brush. Those come in handy for cleaning the scales. Again, you could use soapy water or rubbing alcohol for that as well, but I found Windex works really well to get the scales clean again. Anyway, let's start taking this thing apart and go from there. Before you get started removing hardware, let's protect the blade and ourselves by putting a couple layers of tape of some sort. Masking tape or electrical tape work fine. I usually do 2 layers. So we're ready to start taking the knife apart. The only screws that I'd recommend you guys don't remove are the 2 T8 screws that hold the pocket clip in. Those go into the pocket clip, through the scale, and into the lock bar of the blade, and they actually hold the lock bar in. So if you take those screws out and the lock bar is removed, you might have some trouble putting it back in, or if you don't put it in quite right, you can have issues with the detent or the lockup. But anyway, if you don't have to remove those, don't. If you do have to remove the pocket clip screws, you can take them out to clean the scales or whatever, and you don't actually have to take the lock bar out. If you're careful, you can just leave that lock bar sitting in there. It's kind of a press fit, so it'll stay in unless you pull it out. And do whatever you need to do and then put them back in, and that way you should have no issues with the lock bar moving on you. Anyway, we're gonna start taking the knife apart. So remove the T8 screws holding the scales to the spacers first. There's 4 of those. Put them in a safe spot. And next are your pivot screws. Put those also in a safe spot. I like to leave the blade open for this part. So next thing you have to do is you got to pry apart the scales, and you have to separate them from the spacers at the back and the stop pin and the pivot in the front. So just use any sort of a flat tool to get in there and gently pry them apart. Make sure whatever you're using doesn't have sharp edges. In this case, I'm actually just using the handle or the back end of a butter knife. I've taped it up, which I recommend you do with whatever tool you're using. And that just keeps it from marring up your G10, which you definitely don't want. And if you have to, move the blade around a bit to get at the different spots on the scales. And that's as easy as that. So you're going to end up with 2 scales, a blade, and your 2 bearings and your 2 washers. You can leave your standoffs in and your stop pin in. The pivot pin I usually pull out, which sometimes it just comes out like that. If it doesn't, you can always put a pivot screw down like that and use it to pop the pivot out. Like so. Normally that's not an issue though. And now we're ready to start cleaning it. So we're gonna move on to probably the most self-explanatory part of this whole process. Just use your Q-tip and your rubbing alcohol or your Windex, whatever you're using, to scrub everything off of the scales and the lock bar that's not supposed to be there. We'll fast forward through this part just so you guys don't have to watch me do this. Alright, so those scales are nice and clean now. If you have any stubborn bits, just let them soak a little bit, or if you have to, you can gently scrape them off with your fingernail or whatever. So yeah, those are clean now, and we're going to move on to doing the blade next. So for the blade, same thing, just use your Q-tip and your rubbing alcohol to get into all the nooks and crannies. Most importantly, right around where the bearings ride and inside the pivot. Not a bad idea to do the lock face and where the stop pin rests. Next we'll be cleaning up the pivot and the bearings and the washers. The bearings, you can dribble a little bit of rubbing alcohol right into the cage there, and then just roll it around. That kind of makes sure every part of each of the bearing balls is clean, and rotates them around. You don't have to go too crazy. If they look clean and feel smooth, that's all you're really after. The last step before we go ahead and put this back together is to clean the outside of the scales if they need it. On the darker colors like purple and black, you're not going to notice the dirt as much, but it's there. I can kind of see in the pores that it's probably pretty dirty. You'll really notice it on the tan and the day glow yellow scales, and probably the orange as well. So on these you can be pretty generous with the Windex. Spray it on there. You can rub around with your fingers a bit to get it distributed. And just get any Windex that got onto the inside of the scales before you're done. All the components are clean again, ready to put back together. First thing you're going to do is put a washer, shiny side out. You're going to see where the bearings have been kind of wearing on it, so make sure that's facing towards the blade. Then a bearing, we always put them this way as opposed to that way. So get that ready like that. Then you can gently put your pivot in. Always put it in from the inside of the scale. Just kind of gently push that through so you know it's aligned and in there. Then you can put your washer and bearing combination in the other scale, and we're basically ready to put the blade in there. But before we do that, we're going to put a really small drop of oil on the pivot and on the bearings. I usually put a couple drops, 180 degrees from each other on the bearings. That's all you need. Don't over oil your knife, because extra oil is just going to attract more dust and you're going to get your blade gunked up faster than necessary. So you can put your blade down on there, work it back and forth a bit to distribute that oil, and then I usually kind of put it 90 degrees up like that. Now gently pivot your scales together. That can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes the bearings want to fall out on you. If that happens, just put them back in and try again. Next, you'll put your first pivot screw in, and I like to put it almost all the way, and I put it in all the way until it bottoms, and then I back it out a turn or so. Now you can push your pivot the rest of the way through, and you'll see it's almost coming to the surface of the G10. Put your other pivot screw in, just gently snug that up very lightly for now. Squeeze here to make sure that the scales are both seated into the stop pin. That's very important. And you can do the same here. If you have to, you can push on it like that, and then put your T8 screws in that hold the scales to the spacers. You don't have to tighten these crazy tight at all. They're small screws and they stay put even if they're just gently snugged up. That's one nice thing about having small screwdrivers. It's a lot harder to over tighten your hardware. If you have a regular handled screwdriver, you have to be really careful not to over torque these little fasteners. So the back's tightened up. Once you've got that, we're going to adjust the pivot tightness. So what I'm looking for when I tighten the pivot up is free movement of the blade like that and no blade play. And I've got a little bit of horizontal blade play there, or lateral blade play. So I'm going to really gently snug that up, make sure the other side's snug as well. Still got free travel there when you hold the lock bar out of the way. Totally smooth and no blade play to speak of. If you're not sure, you can tighten it a tiny bit more and see if anything changes. And that's good there. If your blade is not moving, not falling back down freely, that means your pivot's too tight. Usually. So just back it off and make sure you don't have any blade play, and you're good to go. Okay, so we can take the tape off there and test out your knife. Make sure you don't have any slop here. Make sure you don't have any blade play and that you've got free travel throughout the range of motion of the blade. If you do, you're ready to go. You've cleaned and lubricated your knife. That concludes the maintenance of our Skaha folding knife. Hope you guys liked the video. If you did, give it a like, make a comment below if you have any questions. If you have any issues with the process, have a look on our website. We have a write-up describing most of the same things here, and do feel free to give us a call or send us an email. Thanks for watching.